but you wrote a column on Ohio State, and it was, well documented what Urban Meyer said about the roster, and Jim Tressel's high on the roster, and it's pretty much like, anybody with eyeballs that knows who these football players are at Ohio State, from Caleb Downs to Tuimoloau to Judge, like they're the monstars out there in Columbus. Feels like this has to be the year where it's national title or bust. They're not backing off that. Is there a world where Ohio State doesn't win the national championship and there's still a somewhat decent approval rating for Ryan Day and co out there?
I think anything short of, I guess, in this hypothesis, if they don't win the Big Ten, then I say no. So I do think they need to win the Big Ten, and that's a tall task when you're talking about Oregon's now in the conference. What is Michigan going to be, in a post-Harbaugh regime? But I think the Buckeyes should be the favorites to win the Big Ten and likely will win the Big Ten. I don't see them tripping up more than once in that league. But then if you're talking about the 12-team playoff, if they don't win it all but they make it to the semifinals, I think that will still suffice. If they get tripped up earlier, or if they just get bludgeoned in a game against a Texas or a Georgia, there will not be, very many forgiving people in Columbus. I think, the irony of the comments, JD, that Tressel and Meyer made is that, they were kind of painting the picture that, well, it's certainly not going to be a player problem if Ohio State doesn't win this year. Because these guys, this roster is way better than the roster that we ever had. Now, as someone who covered Florida and, lives in Gainesville now, it is funny to hear Urban talk about this being the best roster he's ever seen, when the 2008 roster he coached and won a national championship with produced eventually, not necessarily that exact season, but eventually like some 30-odd NFL players. I don't, maybe Ohio State's roster will do that. Maybe they won't. But, in that column you alluded to, I do think the one concern outside of quarterback, which we touched on Will Howard at the start of this, is going to be the offensive line. It was notable to me that, in this 15 NFL draft picks that they may have, one was an offensive lineman.
Curious. Very curious if you're an Ohio State fan. But like you said.
So if you got one red flag.
That's the one. That's the one to keep an eye on. And I'm not so sure what to make of the offensive line exactly, because I look across this roster and I'm like, okay, a lot of first world problems if you're Ohio State, and there's issues,
sure,
quote unquote, in Columbus. But I think you're on the money. Like Ryan Day, seeing Urban Meyer say that, he's like, hey, thanks guys, appreciate it. Yeah, that's really helpful. So I'm trying to beat Michigan here for the first time in 3 tries. Like, I think if they beat Michigan, win a couple playoff games, I'm so fascinated to see how they treat the Big Ten title game as a fan base, because I personally would sit here in early July, late June, like, I think Oregon's going to be a force. Like, I think they might be my pick to win the Big Ten as we sit here early, just strictly because I think Will Howard's great. I don't know if he's like going to change the game for you against those teams, or if they play Oregon, they got to play him in Autzen and then probably play him again in the Big Ten title game. So I'm still waiting to see a little bit on that pick. But yeah, man, like I think you hit it on the head. It's got to be let's make a run in the playoff. Let's show that we maximize this roster, and maybe maximizing that roster, you bring it full circle, is winning the Big Ten. So, remains to be seen. The thought around Ryan Day's job is so interesting to me, because guys won north of 87% of his games. However, I understand that the folks in Columbus expect, very black and white things. It's beat Michigan, win the Big Ten, win national championships. What do you make of all this discussion around Ryan Day and his job security as a guy who's lost single-digit games?
Well, I've written a lot about Ryan Day and Ohio State in the last 2 years, and I do think, circling back to Tressel's own comments and Day acknowledging as much, Jim Tressel said, Ryan Day's done a really good job, or really something like that, a really good job, at Ohio State. And the difference between really good and great is kind of what Ohio State fans is that sticking point. And Day, to his credit, was candid enough to admit, that's what he has to do, and that means winning the Big Ten again, which hadn't happened in 4 years. That means beating Michigan, which hasn't happened 3 straight times. How much will we view this differently, JD, if that field goal at midnight crosses the crossbars correctly versus going way wide versus Georgia? Probably a lot, because then they would have a national championship, and even if they lost to Michigan that year, you could still say, hey, we got into the dance and we won the dang thing. But they didn't, and they blew a lead in that game. And that's why it's so important that if they lose to this Michigan team, I do think that might be unrecoverable, even for a guy who's lost fewer than 10 games as a head coach, which is remarkable to say. But when you talk about all that Michigan has lost, and this is a game that will be, in the shoe, I believe, that would be tough to come back from.
No, I think that's 100%. Like the way that Michigan brings back so little from last year's squad, new quarterback, new head coach, new coordinators, like a lot of newness to where, okay, if you can't beat this Michigan team, we got to have a very serious talk at the least if we're Ohio State. And my question too, Jesse, is like if I'm Ryan Day, I understand there's a lot of pushback from the folks at Ohio State on what they haven't done on the field and not meeting expectations. I get all that. But if I'm Ryan Day, I'm still sitting there and saying I've lost single-digit games. Like I'm still, statistically speaking, one of the best head coaches in the whole freaking sport. At what point is it a matter of like, hey, just mutually, we both agree this is toxic? Like we're happy, 364 days out of the year together, but that every time a year passes and we don't get the rings, like that toxic couple that that they're just dating and they're not getting married, and every time they don't get married, they have an issue and there's an engagement around them. Like I feel like that's Ryan Day and Ohio State, and I wonder, as much as it's wearing thin on Ohio State, how much this wears thin on Ryan Day and how much he's thinking, hey, I could go 11-1 somewhere else and they would adore me. I'd be the man.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And what's also funny about all this is that Ryan Day has, I think, really attacked his own weaknesses with vigor this offseason. He has said, hey, I need to be a better CEO, so I'm going to cede play calling. Goes out and hires Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien gets poached, brings in Chip Kelly, has an insurance plan, right there. Goes extremely aggressive in the transfer portal, and that he gets their collective on board the second that Michigan wins the national championship. They raise like $1 million. Well, that money and many other millions have gone to good use to both retain the roster and bring in the likes of Caleb Downs, Will Howard, and Quinshon Judkins, and some of these other guys. And then you see what they're doing in the 2025 recruiting class, and it's like, this thing's set up for the engine to just roar. And so if you're Ryan Day, you're like, who the hell are you going to get that's better?
Yeah.
You're not going to go out and hire Kirby Smart. You're not going to, Kalen DeBoer's off the board. Who are you going to get that's better than me? And so it is kind of funny because it's almost like the Spider-Man meme where they're looking at each other like, all right, you're mad at me and I'm pissed at you, but like, yeah, we're in this together, and there's no way out.
I think that's kind of been his MO too since he's gotten there. Like we remember the game against Oregon where Oregon comes in and runs for felt like 1,000,000 yards in the shoe, and he goes, okay, nope, got to switch this up. That offseason to go get Jim Knowles. Defense gets better, and now it's going to be one of the top units in the country heading in 2024. You mentioned the play calling thing with Chip Kelly. Like he's continuing to, it feels like to me, evolve as a head coach. Where who's to say that Ryan Day, what he is this year in 2024, he's not a better version of that 3 years down the road? Because I think it gets overlooked a lot. Like he'd never been a head coach, short of getting the keys tossed to him to be the head football coach at one of the most recognizable brands in the whole freaking sport. Like he'd never done this before. There was no G5 build up to this. And so he's kind of figuring it out on the job. The comp I use a lot is it went from like, hey, he kind of knows how to play guitar to, hey, guess what? You're playing the Grand Ole Opry tomorrow. Best of luck figuring it out. Like that was they threw him into the deep end and told him to swim, and he's done. I think as it's tough because the Michigan game is the black eye, but on paper, from a record perspective, like as good as you could ask for a first time head coach in some respects.
Well, you know what? You know the irony here too is that what if he has a similar kind of come up, thank you, man, see you later as Jim Harbaugh? What if the Bears right down the road? They've been rumored to like Ryan Day for years, but have never pulled the trigger. If Eberflus falls, but then Day ends up, getting Ohio State to the semifinals or the championship game. But maybe they win, maybe they lose. But he says, "Hey, you guys aren't satisfied. I'll take my talents to the Windy City there,
And not have to recruit, not have to worry about NIL.
exactly.
See my family a little bit more. Maybe take some gray hairs.
You can call
out
those
of the beard.
plays again.
Say it again.
Hey, you can call those plays again. You got Caleb Williams sitting there. I mean, there's a lot of ways that this could all, kind of play itself out, I think, for the Buckeyes in 24.
Worst situations to be in if you're Ryan Day. If you end up working in the NFL for an organization that has Caleb Williams playing quarterback for you. Hey, y'all. Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also, be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.